Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and in this video, I want to make you guys an expert on the Power Broker in Marvel Comics in 30 minutes or less. Now, here's the thing. I was going to do a video on Wilfred Nagel, but his whole arc is confined to like basically 4 issues, right? I mean, that's really all you get over the course of the original Isaiah Bradley story, Truth, Red, White, and Black. So we're already covering that story, so there's not really any need because I feel like it would be redundant to do Wilfred Nagel Explained. So we're going to do that on Geek Culture Explained, right? We'll do that as like, a 10-minute video or something like that because we don't do 2-minute explanation videos here. We do long form stuff. So here's the thing about Power Broker. It's a misconception that he appeared in Captain America number 230. It's actually not true. Well, it is true, but it's not true, right? The long and short of this is that the character of Power Broker originally appeared in the old Machine Man stories by Jack Kirby, but he didn't have a name. He was given the name Curtis Jackson in Captain America 230 by Roger McKenzie and Roger Stern, and then he got the name Power Broker in The Thing Volume 1, issue number 33 by Michael Kalin. It's one of these things where it just took Marvel a while to get around to giving this guy an actual identity, but there's a reason for that. The old Jack Kirby stories were pretty straightforward. That's one of the great things about Jack Kirby storytelling is, yes, there were some deep plot threads and they would kind of span on for a little while, and he wrote some pretty complex stuff. But in terms of the level of depth that you needed to understand what was going on in the story, they were never too difficult, right? And so in the old Machine Man Volume 1 series, starting with issue number 7, you had a friend of Machine Man Aaron Stack, a guy by the name of Peter Spaulding. And Peter Spaulding was basically kidnapped by what was called the Corporation, this kind of criminal enterprise that existed out there, and that with Aaron Stack being the most advanced machine on the world at the time, that the idea of the Corporation was to essentially use the design of Machine Man to create more of him, right? To create their own personal robot army, essentially. And so they ended up kidnapping Peter Spaulding, and then they left Machine Man instructions. He followed them, he showed up at their base of operations, and then ultimately freed himself and freed Peter, and then that was basically it, right? The story was pretty straightforward. But from there, you go into when Power Broker effectively starts to matter, and that's the next year, right? The old Machine Man story was in 1978. In 1979, you got Captain America 230. And the reality was that at the time, with Marvel reintroducing Captain America in Avengers issue number 4, the truth about this, I mean, if we're being honest with ourselves, the truth about this is no one knew what to do with it, right? It wasn't until you got to the Mark Gruenwald run with issue number 307 running all the way to 443 that suddenly Marvel had a direction for the character. But he was just there. And that's one of the reasons why when you talk to people who read Captain America back during like the 70s leading up to Mark Gruenwald's run, that they see him as more of an Avengers character as opposed to like his own standalone superhero. Because most all the stories that he had that mattered up to that point was when he was part of the Avengers team, right? His own solo series just was kind of there and stuff happened and he existed and that's essentially it. And so the way this played out is that with a little bit of lead up that actually happened in Captain America 222, that Sam Wilson had essentially just vanished, right? He just disappeared. And the belief at the time by Nick Fury was that he had abandoned his post. And so what you had was him going to Captain America in 230 and saying, we need you to find Sam Wilson. We have no idea where he went to. Now, along for the ride at the time were a few different things. The first was a guy named the Miracle Man, and the second are what were called the Super Shield agents. Now, the Miracle Man was a guy named Wendell Vaughn. Most of you guys have heard of him, and you know him as Quasar. That's probably the most popular role that he's had in Marvel. But at the time, he was newly introduced, and the Super Shield agents were guys like Blue Streak and Vamp. They were basically individuals who were superpowered, right? Who had abilities, and they would offer as kind of like a step up from your average Shield agent. And so Captain America ended up grabbing Miracle Man along with the Super Shield agents, and then went to go track down Sam Wilson, ultimately locating him in a base of operations, under Alcatraz, which of course was being ran by Curtis Jackson. And that's when Curtis Jackson is first named in Marvel Comics. He basically says like, I'm here, I'm Curtis Jackson, that kind of a thing. But the reality and the whole plot of this story centered around the notion that Curtis Jackson had essentially had his guys, which were basically Vamp and Blue Streak, right? They actually turned out to end up, being agents for the Corporation. That Curtis Jackson ran the West Coast division of this multinational criminal enterprise, and that he had kidnapped Sam Wilson for the purpose of drawing Captain America in order to have Captain America go and grab the nephew of Sam Wilson, a guy named Jim Wilson. And the reason why is because Curtis Jackson and his guys had already kidnapped Bruce Banner. And the reason for this was because they wanted to use the Incredible Hulk. Jim Wilson, the nephew of Sam Wilson in Marvel Comics at the time, was a friend of the Incredible Hulk. And so it was believed they could use Jim Wilson to manipulate the Hulk into doing their bidding. Of course, everything opposite of that happened. There was a little bit of corporate espionage that it took place, in the sense that the head of the East Coast operations of the corporation, a guy by the name of Kligger, had actually captured Jim Wilson already. And so it was one of these things where they were kind of vying for power and trying to position themselves. Kligger was trying to take over like all the operations for the corporation across the United States, and it basically made Curtis Jackson look bad in the sense that Kligger could do something that he couldn't do. And of course, once Bruce Banner wakes up and he realizes what's going on, the Incredible Hulk freaks out and starts trashing everything, and the day is basically saved. But it was an instance where Marvel was able to have Wendell Vaughn as Miracle Man face off against the Incredible Hulk to give us as fans a display of what his power was, and it actually proved to be hugely successful. Following that, like, he just went on to become Quasar and became a mainstay comic character after that, right? Which all kind of ran into the Dan Abnett era in the mid-2000s with Annihilation, when he consolidated all the spacefaring stuff into one great big huge epic tale. But following this story, there was a little bit of involvement with Curtis Jackson by Roger Stern in the old Incredible Hulk story, starting with issue number 235, running all the way up to the issue of 237. It was a pretty straightforward issue, right? I mean, or a pretty straightforward story, right? Spanning like 2 or 3 parts. It just kind of led to Curtis Jackson trying to manipulate the Hulk again, and then ultimately fighting Machine Man, and there wasn't a whole lot going on there. The important thing that happened with Curtis Jackson and the notion or the concept of the Power Broker enterprise actually started in Captain America 328, running all the way up to 331. And all that really happened here, it was kind of a series of smaller little events that were taking place. You had a guy by the name of D-Man, who was kind of like this Wolverine-esque character. He's a bit of a joke in Marvel Comics, but he popped up on the scene, and the idea that like John Walker in Battlestar had like strength and speed enhancements had just kind of come out of nowhere. And so this was sort of building up, as far as Mark Gruenwald was concerned, this idea that like somebody out there was giving these people powers, and nobody really knew who it was. It wasn't until you got to Captain America 364 by Mark Gruenwald that you basically found out that Curtis Jackson had founded something called Power Broker Incorporated, which was basically a subsidiary of the corporation that Curtis Jackson inherently worked for, and was basically just a way to broker powers. The way he did this was with a guy named Carl Malice, and Carl Malice was the one who was being featured in those older Captain America 328 through 331 comics, who was basically kidnapping people and then like taking a sample of their powers and then using that to basically store them so that they could be used by Power Broker Incorporated. Because Carl Malice was a guy who was obsessed with powers and using those powers, manipulating those powers, giving powers to other people, things like that. His actions over the course of his life had drawn the attention of Curtis, who had hired him on as essentially the scientific arm of Power Broker Incorporated and the guy that could actually make the company work. And so because of that, with Captain America 364 bringing in the idea of Curtis Jackson being the Power Broker, this ran directly into what was in effect The Thing Volume 1 by Michael Kalin. And the reality of this is that The Thing was kind of like the powerhouse of the Fantastic Four, and the popularity of his character cannot really be overstated here. Fans loved The Thing. They loved Ben Grimm. The Fantastic Four up to that point was basically the first family of Marvel. And while their stories would drop off rapidly in the 1990s, when you had guys like John Byrne who were writing and drawing the Fantastic Four stories back then, they were amazing, right? They were exceedingly well done. And so that kind of popularity and the complexity, the dynamic of a family superhero team bickering and squabbling with one another, which was started with Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, just kind of continued on as a mainstay, right? So even 20 years after their introduction, they were still super popular. And so with The Thing being so popular, Marvel saw fit to give him a solo series, right? To just kind of experiment and see what would happen. It wasn't really my cup of tea. I wasn't really a big fan of The Thing solo series, but a lot of people liked it. But it made sense that if The Thing was a super strong guy, then have him face off against the Power Broker. And so in The Thing Volume 1, issue number 33, and really going into 35, we find out that the Power Broker and his ability to give people super strength is the reason why 75% of the wrestlers in the Unlimited Wrestling Federation in Marvel Comics got their powers from the Power Broker. We also ended up learning here that it was one thing to give people abilities as a one-off, right? But the issue is that if the corporation, first and foremost, was a criminal enterprise wanting to make money, and that Power Broker Incorporated was designed to be the legitimate business face of the corporation itself, then how would you keep people coming back, right? Because after a while, you're going to run through everybody who wants powers, or you're going to draw too much heat on yourself, and authorities are going to come cracking down. And so what they did, what Carl Malice and Curtis Jackson did, is they created a substance or a chemical that was highly addictive, and then added it to the power implementation process, so that when those individuals came to the Power Broker to gain abilities, they would essentially become addicted, and they would constantly have to go back and constantly pay huge sums of money in order to either keep their powers or to ensure their powers stayed afloat. The lie that was told was that once they received the serum enhancement, that they would basically have to keep coming back for regular treatments in order to ensure they kept their powers. And by using this addictive substance, their statement was, at least as far as the people who had those powers was concerned, backed up, right? It was a truthful thing. They just didn't truly know what was going on. And so with the Thing solo series by Michael Kalin, all you really saw here was a few things happening, right? You saw Power Broker Incorporated creating what were called the grapplers, which was basically like their own supervillain team that was composed of just some pretty strong heavy hitters. You saw the Thing, or at least you saw the idea of the grapplers being built up to by the Thing facing off against different members of the grapplers over time. So it was kind of like facing off against one guy and then another guy, then another guy, and then at the end of it all, fighting them all at the same time, right? So that's kind of the slow build that you basically got there. But following that and kind of an accompanying story, or really even, you know, more of a flashback or series of preludes, with Captain America Volume 1, issues number 331, running all the way up to the actual annual for issue number 12, what you basically saw here was Mark Gruenwald and company essentially wrapping up the whole Power Broker story arc, right? And the way this worked is you ended up having the introduction of a character called the Scourge, or a Scourge of the Underworld. We don't really know much about this guy. He was more of like a Punisher-esque type character, but the way this played out is that Scourge was basically on the hunt for Curtis Jackson, right? Trying to take this guy out. And so what you ended up having was him alongside, I guess, an assistant or the person he was with, you know, Lyons, who essentially took refuge from Scourge, who ultimately cornered Curtis Jackson. And so in a last-ditch act of desperation, Curtis actually subjected himself to his own superhero enhancement process. The problem with this was that when it was established in really with Captain America 335 and even going into 364 and as part of the Thing story arc, one of the big side effects is you didn't know exactly what was going to happen. That some individuals actually died when they underwent the process. Others went through it fine. And so there was no indication of what would happen here. And even Curtis himself kind of stated there was a 50-50 chance he would survive if he underwent the process, and a 100% chance he would die if a Scourge of the Underworld gets in that room and goes after him and Jennifer Lyons. And so when he underwent the process, what ended up happening is his body actually grew to this massive muscle-clad size to the point that he couldn't really even move, right? He was literally just too big to be able to control his own body. And he remained that way for essentially the rest of the story arc, going all the way into annual number 12. You did have Carl Malice, who actually went through and tried to de-augment various individuals, and the results are pretty grotesque. Some of the guys were really screwed up in terms of how they looked, but the reality of this is that he just kind of stayed that way. And by all standards of measurement from Mark Gruenwald and them, there was no intention of bringing him back, right? There was no, it was kind of like he's gone now, right? He's just out of the picture, done, and that's basically it. All that changed with essentially maximum security in 2000, in the sense that where this guy was supposed to have been gone, Marvel just kind of wrote in that somewhere along the line he was essentially de-augmented, right? He went back to his normal self. Now, maximum security was basically a story arc where the Kree turned the Earth into a prison planet and Ronan the Accuser was the warden for it all. It sounds cool. I promise you it's not. It's not a good story. It really sucks. And as far as Curtis's involvement here, it was really just trying to use like alien technology to mind control US agent, different things like that. It was not really all that great. There was a little bit that went on there. More recently, back in 2011 with Captain America 615 and kind of the tie-in issues for that, Marvel tried to bring him back. But the reality of this is that Curtis Jackson was reminiscent of a bygone age, right? There was no real interest in his character. There wasn't really any interest in a guy who could broker powers to individuals. And a lot of that kind of came out of the fact that as far as people perceived Marvel at the time, because of the work that had been put in by Joe Quesada, Jimmy Palmiotti, right? The work they'd done at Event Publications when Joe Quesada became editor-in-chief, all those things that had gone on, Marvel was just condensing down, right? They were literally just getting rid of everything. That's why you got House of M when you saw the, 98% of mutants lose their powers at the hands of the Scarlet Witch, when Peter Parker's marriage to Mary Jane Watson was nullified, when the Avengers were disassembled. I mean, it was Judgment Day in Marvel Comics. Like, Quesada went through and just cleaned house. And so people's perception was, okay, if Marvel's gonna start reintroducing things, then it's gotta be things that matter and things that are important. And Curtis Jackson just wasn't one of those, right? He just wasn't something that fans were really interested in. And so you saw a little bit of a story arc and you saw a little bit of involvement here, but that was it, right? You go into The Punisher Volume 9 with issue number 13, and there is Marvel really kind of throws it out there that, like, or at least the prevailing theory among fans is that Curtis was killed by the Punisher. There really isn't anything to support that. As far as I'm aware, he was just there, right? And that was it, right? We don't really know what happened to him. We don't know really where he went. Presumably he'll show back up in the US agent storyline as it exists right now. And because of what we're seeing in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, I can bet you bottom dollar he will show up somewhere. Marvel Comics just kind of chases after the movies now and releases content based on what the movies are doing. So most likely you'll see him reappear, but that's basically it, right? I mean, Power Broker's pretty basic, pretty straightforward. He was a guy who at one point rose to prominence as a member of what was called the Corporation, a criminal enterprise. He essentially gave people powers and then just kind of drifted off to the land of obscurity when Marvel stopped caring and fans stopped caring. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.